In this video, I will provide evidence-based guidance on how to interpret your continuous glucose monitor or CGM data. I will share how you can use your CGM data to get a sense of your own glucose tolerance and understand the difference between a normal blood sugar response and a concerning blood sugar spike. At the end of this video, you will understand whether your blood sugar responses to your typical meals are fine or concerning and require you to take action. Hello, welcome to Nourished by Science on YouTube. My name is Mario, and on this channel I share evidence-based information about nutrition and chronic disease prevention. In this video, I will help you interpret your CGM data by discussing what the scientific evidence tells us about normal versus abnormal glucose responses after a meal. CGMs can be an amazing tool, particularly if we use them not just to lower our acute blood sugar responses. That's a pretty easy thing. We just have to eat fewer carbs. No, where CGMs really offer an opportunity that I feel most people are not taking advantage of is to really understand our own glucose tolerance. That is the ability of our body to keep blood sugar in the normal range, no matter what we eat. So with this video, I'll help you use your CGM data to understand to which degree you may be glucose intolerant. We will also discuss how to tell the difference between a normal blood sugar response to a meal and a concerning spike, and I'll evaluate the very popular claim that any increase in blood glucose by 30 milligrams per deciliter or more is abnormal and dangerous. In other words, that such an increase by 30 milligrams per deciliter or more constitutes a blood sugar spike that we should try to avoid. Diabetes and prediabetes. If we discuss normal versus abnormal blood glucose, we must mention diabetes and prediabetes first, of course, because these are the two conditions of glucose intolerance that are clearly defined clinically. In most countries, diabetes is diagnosed if someone has fasting blood glucose of 126 milligrams per deciliter or higher, an HbA1c of 6.5% or higher, or blood glucose concentrations exceeding 200 milligrams per deciliter exactly 2 hours after drinking a beverage containing 75 grams of pure glucose as part of an oral glucose tolerance test, or OGTT. Prediabetes is diagnosed if someone doesn't meet criteria for diabetes, but their fasting glucose level is between 100 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, HbA1c is 5.7 to 6.4%, or the blood glucose concentration at 2 hours in an OGTT is between 140 and 199 milligrams per deciliter. If you have been diagnosed by a doctor to have either diabetes or prediabetes, by these criteria, this means that you are definitely glucose intolerant to some degree and that you do have abnormal blood glucose levels. Now, if you have not been told that you have diabetes or prediabetes, you may still have one or the other because the number of undiagnosed people with these conditions is thought to be very high in most countries. In that case, you can use your CGM data to get a sense of whether you should see a doctor for some more testing. Note that you cannot use your CGM to diagnose any condition because the diagnostic criteria are all based on standardized lab testing. But you can get a pretty solid idea of whether your blood sugar levels are normal or not and whether any follow-up with a professional is warranted. For one, take a look at your fasting glucose levels in the morning. Are these always higher than 100 milligrams per deciliter or even higher than 126 milligrams per deciliter? These are the thresholds for prediabetes and diabetes, respectively. Note that quite often our glucose levels rise just a little bit just as we wake up and start our day. This is a normal phenomenon called the dawn effect that is triggered by the levels of the hormone cortisol going up in the morning. It's quite mild in most people, but people with diabetes can have a very pronounced dawn effect. Look at your baseline glucose levels before they start to rise. If that number is consistently higher than 100 milligrams per deciliter, I suggest you discuss this with your doctor. Then take a look at your typical glucose levels exactly 2 hours after you started eating a meal. Are these still elevated above your normal baseline level? As you can see in this table, elevated 2-hour glucose levels are a diagnostic criterion for prediabetes and diabetes. But that is in the context of a 75-gram oral glucose tolerance test. This test involves drinking a beverage containing 75 grams of pure glucose, and this much glucose by itself, without any other food, is a much more substantial load to handle than an average meal, even a high-carb meal. So again, we cannot use our normal blood sugar response to our typical meals to diagnose prediabetes or diabetes. What I would say though is that if your baseline glucose level is under 100 milligrams per deciliter and you regularly have levels higher than 140 milligrams per deciliter around 2 hours after starting a meal, I would talk to a doctor and discuss whether some more testing may be indicated. If we are fully glucose tolerant, our glucose levels should be back to our baseline level under 100 milligrams per deciliter or close to it by the 2-hour mark, unless this was a particularly large or extended feast with several courses. So if your glucose levels after your typical meals look like this here, still quite a bit elevated, above 100 milligrams per deciliter 1.5 and even 2 hours after starting a meal, this may be indicative of glucose intolerance. And in a case like this, the cause is often insulin resistance. I have left links to several videos below in the description box in which I explain what insulin resistance is and also how you can figure out whether you are insulin resistant and why you may be insulin resistant. Now, it's very important to be clear that our glucose responses to our meals can only shed light on whether or not we are glucose tolerant or intolerant if these meals do contain at least some carbohydrates. If you eat a low-carb meal of just meat and non-starchy vegetables, your blood glucose will not rise meaningfully, even if you are glucose intolerant. There's nothing wrong with eating low-carb or even very low-carb meals, but just be sure not to fool yourself into thinking that this means that your glucose tolerance is great. So again, if you want to use your CGM to understand what your glucose tolerance is like, you can do that only if your meals contain at least some carbs, for example in the form of grains, starchy vegetables, or fruit. It is also important to understand that following a low-carb diet in general will make you somewhat glucose intolerant temporarily, because your body will release less insulin on an occasional cheat meal rich in carbs. So if you have been following a low-carb diet and would like to get a sense of your glucose tolerance, introduce small amounts of carbs slowly over several weeks, and then start eating a normal diet with higher carbohydrate content again, and only then use a CGM to measure your glucose responses to these higher carb meals. Okay, so we have discussed how we can use our fasting glucose levels and the glucose levels 2 hours after we started eating a meal to get a sense of whether we are glucose tolerant or intolerant. What about that time between the fasting state and the time point 2 hours after a meal though? That's actually the most interesting time because that's when the blood sugar level rises to some peak and then falls back, ideally to baseline. Is there anything that could happen during these 2 hours immediately following a meal that could alert us that maybe our blood sugar regulation is not perfect? And related to this is the question, is there such a thing as a blood sugar spike, meaning a blood sugar response to a meal that is too high, even if our fasting and 2-hour levels are just fine? Let's start this discussion by taking a look at a very common claim on social media. Is an increase in blood glucose after a meal by 30 milligrams per deciliter an abnormal and dangerous spike? There are several popular influencers and also at least one company that markets CGMs who claim that any increase in blood glucose levels by 30 milligrams per deciliter or more is an abnormal and dangerous blood sugar spike. What this claim suggests is that if someone has a fasting glucose of around 80 milligrams per deciliter and their blood glucose rises to, say, 120 milligrams per deciliter or 130 milligrams per deciliter after a meal, that this is abnormal and also leads to negative health consequences compared to someone in whom blood glucose doesn't ever go higher than 30 milligrams per deciliter above the baseline. In this case, that would be 110 milligrams per deciliter. So let's examine this claim. Is an increase in blood sugar by 30 milligrams per deciliter indeed abnormal, meaning it is not part of normal physiology? And is it dangerous? That is, do we have evidence to suggest that such a blood sugar spike is harmful to our health in some way? Is an increase in blood sugar after a meal by 30 milligrams per deciliter abnormal? Well, let's just review the blood sugar data of normal, healthy people as they live their normal lives. I have reviewed a number of studies in which researchers equipped such healthy people with a CGM. And as I was reviewing these papers, I could immediately see where that 30 milligram per deciliter figure probably came from. But I do think this is a misinterpretation of these data. Let's take a look. 2 studies have reported that whenever blood glucose levels rise throughout the day, the average rise is about 30 milligrams per deciliter. And I guess that has been interpreted as suggesting that blood sugar levels don't rise by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter in healthy people. This is an incorrect interpretation. For one, if the average rise in blood sugar is 30 milligrams per deciliter, that means that a good portion of these healthy people with normal glucose tolerance experience an increase by 35, 40, or 45 milligrams per deciliter regularly. Also, and this is an important point, the 30 milligrams per deciliter figure relates to any rise in blood sugar. Scientists call this metric MAGE, the mean amplitude of glycemic excursions. Now, blood sugar can rise for any number of reasons, such as after we have eaten a little snack, experienced a bit of stress, or exercised. Or it could be in response to a major meal. Now, the 30 milligram per deciliter figure is the average increase in blood sugar whenever there is any increase in blood sugar beyond a certain threshold. In other words, to calculate MAGE, researchers don't even pay attention to whether a meal was eaten or not. They just look at the CGM data, and anytime the glucose concentration rises by more than, say, 10 milligrams per deciliter above the baseline, they call this a glycemic excursion. And then they average how much the glucose levels rise in each of these glycemic excursions. That 30 milligram per deciliter figure, therefore, contains a lot of occasions where the sugar level rose even if no meal or even a snack was consumed. It is therefore very likely, in my opinion, that the average response to a normal mixed meal is substantially higher than that 30 milligram per deciliter figure. And indeed, one group of researchers looked into exactly that. Frackman and colleagues investigated the blood sugar responses to normal breakfasts, lunches, and dinners. These investigators enrolled 12 women and 12 men who were young and who had a normal body weight and normal glucose tolerance. The investigators ran oral glucose tolerance tests before enrolling participants and excluded anyone with any sign of prediabetes or diabetes. So these were 24 young, lean, and healthy people who are probably among the more glucose tolerant people on the planet. And they should give us, some sense into what the normal blood sugar response to full meals looks like. Take a look at this table. Prior to each of the main meals, their blood sugar levels were around 80, 82 milligrams per deciliter, and the average increase was between 39 and 50 milligrams per deciliter. In some people less than that, but in others more than that. See here, some people had peak glucose around 160 milligrams per deciliter. Maybe they were not starting at 80 milligrams per deciliter, but around 95 milligrams per deciliter, but that still means they had an increase in glucose in response to the meal well in excess of 60 milligrams per deciliter. So I ask you, if the average blood glucose increase in such a young, normal weight and healthy population is 40 to 50 milligrams per deciliter, with some people showing an increase by 60 or more milligrams per deciliter, how can anyone claim that an increase by 30 milligrams per deciliter is abnormal and not part of normal physiology? I cannot explain it and absolutely do not understand where this argument comes from. I would even go further and call this dangerous fear-mongering. If you're still not convinced, I invite you to visit the blog post associated with this video in which I discuss the studies in this area in more detail and also link all relevant references. You'll find the link in the description box below the video. And that brings us to address the second part of the claim, namely, is an increase in blood glucose by 30 milligrams per deciliter or more dangerous? Right, so maybe blood sugar does normally rise by 40, 50 or even 60 milligrams per deciliter even in the most glucose tolerant people, but maybe that is not desirable and even dangerous for our long-term health. Well, here is where I can make it even quicker. I've worked in clinical nutrition and diabetes research for more than 20 years, and I know of no paper that shows, or at least suggests, that an increase in blood glucose by, say, 40 or 50 milligrams per deciliter is associated with short-term or long-term health risks compared to an increase by 30 milligrams per deciliter. Sorry, I can't show you any data here because there are just none that I'm aware of. In conclusion, the claim that increases in blood sugar levels after a meal by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter are abnormal is factually incorrect. In fact, increases by 40 to 50 milligrams per deciliter and even 60 milligrams per deciliter occur regularly, even in the most glucose-tolerant individuals. Regarding the claim that increases by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter are dangerous or linked to adverse health outcomes, I'm not aware of even a single paper supporting that claim. For these reasons, I suggest you ignore this claim that an increase by 30 milligrams per deciliter is a spike that should be avoided. And I say this as someone who strongly believes that blood sugar concentrations and related biomarkers, such as our insulin sensitivity, are among the most important chronic disease risk factors. But I also feel that it is not helpful to make even fully glucose tolerant people think that they have a problem when in fact their blood sugar regulation is just fine. Okay, so if small bumps in blood sugar are not abnormal and dangerous, what kind of glucose response to a meal is abnormal and associated with an increased risk of chronic disease? Let's discuss how I define blood sugar spikes. Well, one thing we need to be clear about is that we currently don't have a clinical definition of blood sugar spikes. In other words, you could not be diagnosed as having blood sugar spikes. We also need to be very clear that the thresholds used to diagnose diabetes and prediabetes only apply to the fasting state and the 2-hour time point in an OGTT. These thresholds do not apply to any random time point after a meal. In other words, if your blood glucose concentration rises above 140 milligrams per deciliter about, say, 30 minutes or 1 hour after a meal, this does not mean that you have prediabetes. I mentioned earlier that several research teams have studied the normal blood sugar levels in people with normal glucose tolerance as determined by standardized clinical testing. I've summarized all of the data from people who did not have prediabetes or diabetes in this table here. One thing we can see quite clearly is that in all of these study populations, blood sugar levels are mostly in the 70 to 140 milligram per deciliter range. 93 to 99% of the time. But in all populations, blood sugar levels do spend some time in the 140 to 180 milligram per deciliter range. That percentage varies from study to study, between 0.4 and 4% of the time. This means that on average, people with normal glucose tolerance do occasionally have blood sugar levels in the 140 to 180 milligram per deciliter range, but only briefly, for a total of up to an hour a day or so. Now, here's something interesting. In 3 of the studies, blood sugar never, not in a single participant, ever reached 180 milligrams per deciliter or more. In the other 3 studies in which this metric has been reported, some participants had blood sugar levels exceeding 180 milligrams per deciliter occasionally. In this paper here by Chan and colleagues, the authors studied obese youth. So these were young participants, but they carried excess body fat mass. And excess body fat mass is a major risk factor for insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. And they described explicitly that some of the obese youth occasionally had excessively high blood sugar levels, reaching as high as 239 milligram per deciliter. That is definitely not normal. The other 2 studies that reported occasional blood sugar levels exceeding 180 milligrams per deciliter had enrolled older individuals, and again, older age is a major risk factor for insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. That suggests to me that those few individuals in these studies who had blood sugar levels exceeding 180 milligrams per deciliter occasionally are already a little bit glucose intolerant, possibly due to insulin resistance related to higher body fat mass or higher age. Therefore, I interpret these data to cumulatively suggest that in fully glucose-tolerant populations, ideal blood sugar levels are mostly in the 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter range, with very rare and only brief excursions into the 140 to 180 milligram per deciliter range, whereas levels of 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher are never seen. This also means that I would interpret blood sugar levels reaching 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher as an early sign of glucose intolerance, which we should try to avoid. That is why I define any increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter as a blood sugar spike. There's another rationale for considering an increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher a spike, and that is that we have evidence suggesting that regular increases in blood sugar to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher are associated with an increased risk of chronic disease. So let's discuss this next. Do we have evidence that blood sugar spikes to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher are a health risk? We know for sure that having chronically elevated blood sugar levels, as in diabetes, is associated with substantially increased risks of a number of chronic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and chronic kidney disease. But what about people who mostly have normal glucose levels, but spike to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher regularly? Well, it would be ideal if we had data from tens of thousands of people who had worn a CGM for an extended period of time so that we could actually see whether those with a spiking pattern have an increased risk of disease. Unfortunately, we don't have any such data. However, we do have some indirect evidence based on a biomarker of blood sugar spikes called 1,5-anhydroglucitol, or 1,5-AG. I mentioned this biomarker briefly in a prior video, but I guess most of you have probably not heard about it, so let me briefly explain what this is about. In short, 1,5-AG is a sugar that all of us have in our blood. Under normal circumstances, the blood concentrations of 1,5-AG are pretty stable. But as soon as our blood glucose levels exceed about 180 milligrams per deciliter, we start to excrete some glucose in the urine, and 1,5-AG is excreted along with that glucose. This means that the more our blood glucose levels rise above 180 milligrams per deciliter, and the longer they remain elevated above that threshold, the lower our 1,5-AG levels in blood will be. This means that 1,5-AG levels in the blood of someone who has diabetes and who constantly has blood sugar levels over 180 milligrams per deciliter will be very, very low. But it also means that for anyone who does not have diabetes or even prediabetes, blood 1,5-AG levels will be reduced if they experience frequent blood sugar spikes to 180 milligrams per deciliter or more. And this is of interest because lower blood levels of 1,5-AG are consistently and strongly associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, and cancer mortality, and that is even in people without diabetes or prediabetes, and even when adjusted for traditional markers of blood sugar regulation, such as HbA1c or fasting plasma glucose. Reactive hypoglycemia. Lastly, let's talk about reactive hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is defined as a blood sugar level below 70 milligrams per deciliter. Often, particularly if concentrations drop below 60 milligrams per deciliter, people do feel the body responding to these low blood sugar levels. Common symptoms include feeling hungry, particularly for something sweet, feeling dizzy, anxious, tired, or weak, sweating, shaking, or heart palpitations. A CGM can be a great tool to detect if you frequently suffer from hypoglycemia. If you observe your glucose levels dropping below 70 milligrams per deciliter regularly, I suggest you discuss this with a doctor. Hypoglycemia can be dangerous, and if you experience this regularly, you should not take it lightly. One word of caution, however. If you lie on your CGM sensor at night, it can show very low glucose levels, not because you actually have hypoglycemia, but because of the pressure on your sensor. And CGM sensors can also be faulty every once in a while and show incorrectly low glucose levels. It may be prudent to have a handheld glucose meter available, the one that requires finger pricking to get a drop of blood, so that you can check your actual blood glucose concentrations if you ever have any weird or extreme glucose readings on your CGM. Now, hypoglycemia can develop for many reasons, but a common reason is in response to a blood sugar spike. One thing that can happen is that someone eats a high-carb meal, and that leads to a rapid increase in blood sugar levels. And then the body senses that blood sugar levels are too high and secretes a lot of insulin. And that then drives glucose levels down too fast and too much. If you observe this pattern, try to take steps to avoid the blood sugar spike from happening in the first place. That will dramatically reduce your risk of reactive hypoglycemia. Check the videos I've linked in the description box below the video, where I explain what you can actually do to avoid a blood sugar spike. In summary, taking these considerations together, I conclude that any increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher is probably a first sign of mild glucose intolerance, because it doesn't normally occur in the most glucose-tolerant populations ever, no matter what they eat. And such an increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher is probably associated with an increased risk of several chronic diseases, at least if it occurs regularly. That's why I define an increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter as a spike that we want to avoid. Further, we should keep our blood sugar in the 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter range most of the time, with only occasional and brief excursions into the 140 to 180 milligrams per deciliter range. If you spend more than an hour or so per day in that 140 to 180 milligrams per deciliter range, that is likely also a sign of glucose intolerance. My strong suggestion is that if you have diabetes or prediabetes, you follow suggestions by a doctor to control your blood sugar levels. I also recommend that you try to identify the root cause or causes of your glucose intolerance, such that you can address these so that you can prevent your condition from getting worse and ideally even reverse it. I've linked some videos in the description box below to help you understand glucose intolerance and its causes better. Similarly, if you do not have diabetes or prediabetes but show early signs of glucose intolerance, try to identify and address the root cause or causes of your glucose intolerance to prevent it from progressing to prediabetes or manifest diabetes. Signs of such early stage glucose intolerance that are apparent from your CGM data would be regular blood sugar spikes to 180 milligrams per deciliter or higher, or if your sugar level is in the 140 to 180 milligram per deciliter range for extended periods of time after meals, such that it adds up to more than an hour per day. To me, this is actually the more impactful use of a CGM, to identify any issues in our glucose tolerance early so that we can address them, not to totally flatten an already normal glucose curve. That's it for this video. If this was helpful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left a like below, and even more if you shared this video with anyone you know who you think may be interested. Next, watch this video on how to get the most benefit from using your CGM, and this one below, in which I explain glucose tolerance and all of the key factors determining glucose tolerance, including insulin sensitivity, pancreatic beta cell function, and glucose effectiveness. Till next time, take care.